Hi there, it's the second Sunday after Epiphany, and I thought I'd share a short reflection on the scripture readings that are being suggested for today. The first reading is from the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 2, verse 1 to 11, and the gospel reading is from John, chapter 2, verse 1 to 11. And I thought that since tomorrow is the commemoration of Martin Luther King Jr., it would have been his birthday tomorrow, that it's worth having a look at these scripture readings in dialogue with some of his thought about the what he calls the beloved community. So I'll put a link to an article from the King Center that summarizes his idea of the beloved community. So feel free to pause the video and have a look at those readings and then start the video again. I think it's good today to reflect on our scripture readings in dialogue with the more recent idea of the beloved community articulated by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. near the midpoint of last century, because I think all of these readings from 1 Corinthians, from John's Gospel, and from the summary of Dr. King's thinking involve people in community challenging the idea that we're all just autonomous individuals. In the epistle, we heard the voice of the Apostle Paul telling the ancient Christian community in the Greek port of Corinth that even though they may have a diverse range of gifts, all of these different gifts are being given by God's Spirit. The letter says that even though they may have their differences, everyone who follows Jesus as their Lord has arrived at that conclusion by the guidance of God's Spirit. The letter says that God's Spirit gives people different gifts, but all of those gifts are intended to benefit the whole community. The gifts are for the common good, not just for the benefit of the individual or for the benefit of people in the church, but for the good of the wider community. A number of different gifts are listed, and I think it might be interesting to think about which ones we feel are important. So it says, to one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit. To another, faith by the same Spirit. To another, gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another, the work of miracles. To another, prophecy. To another, the discernment of spirits. To another, various kinds of tongues. To another, the interpretation of tongues. My guess is that some of us would feel a bit unsure or uncomfortable about some of those gifts, particularly about the talk of speaking in tongues, especially considering that a particular Australian Pentecostal church is constantly in the middle of unfavourable news stories. One of the common rumours about Hillsong is that people at their church gatherings babble ecstatically when they worship. That does happen at plenty of Pentecostal churches, but it doesn't really happen at Hillsong, because of a recognition that it doesn't make a lot of sense to onlookers. The person exercising this gift may feel that they're being released from bondage. They may feel that they're being able to pray in a way that they couldn't put into words. But if it's confusing or disturbing for others, that's not serving the common good. It's just serving the individual. If it's just for the benefit of the individual who's able to clear their mind through the practice, get things off their chest by speaking in tongues, then it's better for them to do it discreetly or in private. And some people in our church do that, in my tradition. Just this week, there's been a negative story in the news about Hillsong having a youth camp featuring singing and dancing and looking a lot like a music festival at a time when so many secular artists are unable to perform at festivals or concerts, and at a time when we have record-breaking numbers of infections and deaths due to COVID. It's not the kind of thing Christians should be known for. I've seen a lot of Christians condemning this event. I think Hillsong are an easy target because they don't look like a traditional church. They're a more contemporary expression of church that looks more like something created by contemporary Australian culture, rather than looking like a historical artifact like some of the traditional churches. I think we need to remember that the reason that churches have had these freedoms while the arts community have continued to be so heavily restricted is because leaders from Hillsong and Bishops of more traditional churches as well, in Sydney and Melbourne, made a lot of complaints about churches being restricted in 2020. Compared to the arts, we've been given special treatment, and I don't actually think that's good, because I think it actually works against the good of the whole community, because it means things are not equal. There's one rule for us and another rule for others. It divides the community and it leads to resentment. As a church tradition, I think we're in a place where we sit between the more traditional looking churches and the more contemporary and evangelical churches. I think it's important that we prioritize relationships with the other churches, whether they look more traditional or whether they look more contemporary. And we need to include those that we have significant differences with when we dialogue with other churches. It doesn't mean trying to become the same as them, but listening to each other in order to understand what we hold in common and where we differ. As the epistle says, we're all motivated to follow Christ by the same Spirit, even if we have different gifts. Returning to Dr. King, his practice was to work with people whatever tradition they came from, people of various Christian traditions as well as people of other faiths and ideologies. He was in dialogue with people who had the same goals but significant differences, like Malcolm X, who argued that black people should fight to protect themselves from racist violence. And he was in dialogue also with his opponents, with the people he was challenging, the people who were trying to stop him, the people he was seeking to reform so that justice would be done and then reconciliation could happen. I think we also need to remember that while stories of the civil rights movement often centre on specific big personalities, like Dr. King or Rosa Parks or Malcolm X, these people didn't achieve anything on their own. They made progress towards this vision of the beloved community as part of a movement of many unknown and unrecognised people. While the concept of the beloved community was developed a lot by Dr. King, it also wasn't his own original concept. It was a concept he received from an earlier generation, from Josiah Royce, a philosopher and theologian from the beginning of the 20th century, and King developed his own understanding of the idea. So these struggles are not about one person, they're about a whole community that works together. That's the case when we seek to honour First Peoples and when we support their efforts towards self-determination. It's not our place to be at the centre of those struggles if we're not Indigenous, because it's not stuff that we should be in charge of if we're not Indigenous. If we're not Indigenous, it's our place to be part of a community that supports what First Peoples are doing. Supporting refugees and challenging our government's treatment of them is not something that can be done by one heroic individual. It's something that needs to be done as part of a community. And where there are people in those efforts who are more visible as spokespeople for the movement, it's best if those roles are occupied by refugees themselves, by people who are most affected. Before I finish, I want to say something brief about the Gospel reading. It's also a reading that isn't about the individual, but about the community. It's about a wedding, an event that joins a couple together, but also a ceremony that knits together the whole community. So everyone in the community is there. The fact that the wine has run out at the wedding is a disaster. Being the host of a wedding and running out of wine is not something that I would wish on you. It'd be a cause for great shame. Mary knows this when she tells her son about the shortage, and Jesus basically says it's not their problem. It seems very callous toward the host and very rude towards his mother. I wonder what's going on here. He does sort out a solution, a miraculous solution, but I think he does it in a way that not everyone has to know, in a way that preserves the dignity of the host. He only knows about the problem because of community, because his mother knows what's going on behind the scenes. And he uses his gift for the common good rather than for his own benefit. I invite you to take some time just to consider what God's Spirit may be saying to us through these ancient stories and through the stories that are going on around us in our society today.